Doing anything by yourself can be an incredibly daunting task, but when it comes to patterning an 18th century gown, which is meant to be literally draped on top of the body, it seems nearly impossible. But because I had recently made a new pair of 18th century stays that were a completely different style and shape than my previous pairs, I needed to make a new 18th century gown pattern. And I didn't have anyone here to help me with that. With the upcoming 18th century ball, I also didn't have the time to just wait for the next time I'd be around a friend. So instead, I needed to figure out a way to drape an entire 18th century gown on myself by myself. And because this was already going to be a time crunch situation, I also knew that I needed to come up with a design that was relatively simple for me to make. If you look at ball gowns from the 1760s, they are covered in yards and yards of trim and fringe and lace and so much effort. I did not have time for that. Instead, I chose to go with the 1780s, which has a lot cleaner of a look. It's a lot more forgiving in terms of the amount of effort that it's going to take, and it is one of my favorite decades. I knew that I wanted something that was going to have a little bit of impact in the fabric area. All I really had in my collection to pull from were plain silk taffetas, which are great for many things, but not terribly exciting for an untrimmed gown. Instead, I ended up finding a striped fabric that has a really lovely color that's a little bit changeable between a plum and a red and a gold tone, and that was going to be the impact, so that way I didn't have to do the time portion of this. However, the fabric is relatively expensive, so I also knew that ideally I was going to be doing a contrasting petticoat, so that way I wouldn't have to buy the extra couple of yards for that. I do have an ivory silk satin petticoat in my collection that I've had for many, many years, and it's gone with many gowns over the time, so I knew that I'd head that direction since there are so many fashion plates from the 1780s that have contrasting ivory satin petticoats. Some of them also do have little spots embroidered in them or a little bit of gold work done, and I ended up finding an ivory net that had gold spots woven into it and made a separate petticoat to go over my ivory satin one very quickly, very simply, and thankfully very cheaply as well. So that way it gave a little bit of sparkle and interest without me having to spend a lot of time and money on trim, which meant that I just had to worry about the gown. For the back, that was pretty straightforward. The 1780s are really fond of the more fitted styles of back rather than the sack back styles. It's also the point where we're moving away from the pleated backs into the pieced styles, the Italian gowns as they're often called, and that was a style that I particularly loved because you can get the really low long V at the bottom and the really fluffy big skirts, which looks wonderful if you want a train on your skirt. And that was something that I thought would give the impact without me having to put more effort into it, just a little bit more fabric, but not too much. So I ended up going with that style. I do highly recommend that if you go with a train on any of your gowns for any events like the ball that I'm going to, where there's going to be lots of people, even if you aren't planning on dancing, make sure that there's some way to hoist that up. I ended up putting a couple of thread loops and a tape inside of the skirt of my gown, so that way I could hoist it whenever things started to get too busy or too active, which is definitely a good choice because more than one person ended up with their train being stepped on so heavily that it ripped off of their gown. Everything's okay, they can repair it, but it's still really difficult to deal with that at an event when you don't have a sewing kit with you or the time to fix it. Definitely recommend doing that. As for the front of my gown, that's where I did make mistakes. The back, great. The front, not so much. I ended up going with what we call a cutaway style. It's not the historical term for it just because there are so many variations on this. I've done versions previously that were straight edged, so that way there was sort of an upside down V stomacher in front that it laces or pins over, and I really do like that style, but I wanted to go with the curved front. I had done that many, many years ago with one of my first 18th century gowns that I ever made in a striped fabric, and I loved the effect. So I ended up reproducing that, but I thought I wanted to change out the stomacher at some point and not just do the stripe, but I also didn't have a matching ivory silk or really any that I could make a stomacher out of for that contrast style, so I decided I was going to have to go with the stripe for now, but maybe I could change it out for the plain ivory satin stomacher that I do have at some point, or I could go with a laced up one up the front. Lots of different styles. I figured I could just make all these different stomachers and keep changing them out, which seems like a great idea until I realized when I put it on for one of the fittings that with that curved cutaway style, it's not easy to attach to the stomacher. In the 18th century, gowns are usually pinned on with straight pins because you can just pin into the stays these, but usually you're pinning a vertical line, and I tried doing straight pins in a sort of rotating way all the way around, and it just didn't work. It still buckled and puckered. So I ended up having to, at the last second, actually stitch the stomacher into the front, which I wish that from the beginning I had just done it as one piece. It's just a lot easier to fake the seam, which is historically accurate. They definitely did that. But it's just a lot easier to fake the seam and not have to worry about pins and movement and everything just not laying flat. Because the thing is, when you're getting ready for these big events, you want to make sure that the day of, that you're going to be able to put these things on easily and comfortably, and you will be comfortable for the rest of the night. And that was definitely a feature that I kept in mind as I was draping and patterning this thing and designing it and making it, knowing that I want a gown that I'm going to continue to feel comfortable wearing over and over and over again, styling in different ways, and making sure that I can actually wear this for hours upon hours into the evening. So comfort is the key, which, speaking of comfort, actually brings me to the sponsor for this week's video, Brooklinen. If you're like me and absolutely ready to cozy up for the coming winter, it's the perfect time to check out Brooklinen. They have a wide range of luxury home goods focusing on high quality textiles. And their luxury goods don't come with an over-the-top luxury price. I've actually been getting my sheets, bedding, and towels from them for nearly a decade, and the quality is outstanding. Natural fibers and good quality textiles have always been an important part of my life, whether I'm talking about clothing or bedding. Not only does Brooklinen have a wide array of cotton, linen, and even wool sheets, they even have more than 20 different options for colors and patterns. You can mix and match to fit your decor and the season. I rely on the hardcore bundle, which not only has the core sheet set, but extra pillowcases and a duvet cover, and you save 25% over individual items that way. And I'm not just switching out colors for winter, they have super cozy comforters in different weights. So I'm adding some extra fluff to my bed by switching out my all-season comforter with the ultra-warm down alternative comforter. Their down alternative pillows and comforters are made with cotton sateen and recycled PET filler and stay fluffy, even when a certain fluff ball snuggles on them every night. Right now, Brooklinen is having their Black Friday sale, and all Brooklinen items are 20% off until November 29th. You can save even more by stacking this with their bundle discount, so I recommend getting the hardcore bedding bundle like I did. This is your time to finally refresh your bedding or get a jump start on your holiday shopping, since this is their largest sale of the year. Thanks again to Brooklinen for sponsoring this week's video and making sure that I had a very comfortable, cozy bed to come home to after this long trip, because it was an intensive trip with so many things going on, and I will be posting more about that, particularly on Instagram. But for right now, let's get into how to drape and pattern an 18th century gown on yourself by yourself. To start with, tie a tape around the waist and around the bust, basically as high as you can go before the stays really cut out on the sides. I would go with a wider tape than I did, but ½ inch works. I just maybe go with 1 inch. And you're going to measure down your back. Use a camera for this, just set up your phone or whatever you've got. You just need to drop it straight down. If you can't reach back to your waist, put a weight on the end of the tape and hold it back there. Doesn't matter at what point, we're just going to double check the picture for those measurements later. Same thing goes with a width. Just drape it around your shoulders. It doesn't matter how it lines up. You just need to be able to get an image of it, pause the video, and be able to see where those marks are. So that's all we're going to need for our basic measurements to start. I'm going in then, drawing a long straight line down the center of the back, and I'm marking out the points where the tapes met, as well as how high up the back I want it to go and how low I want it to go. It's a personal style and era preference as to how high or how low it is. So once I have all of those things marked out, I'm double checking that width at the point that's just a couple inches below where I wanted the potential top of my gown in the back. So I'm marking out that width, equal distant, and then I can go in and start drawing out the shape. So I know I wanted a really deep point below my waist, so you can see there's a pretty good distance there of about 4 or 5 inches. This is definitely a place where I'd recommend referencing some sort of pattern off of an original in order to get the shape that you're looking for. The back width up at the neck is up to you as well. It's narrower in the later time periods, a little wider as you go back further, but again, this is a matter of your preference. I know about what looks right on me. I need about 2.5 or so inches at that shoulder slope for where the strap will attach. This is just what I'm used to doing with gowns, but if you have another gown to compare this to, or if you have an original to look at, you're just kind of going for a shape here. This isn't a matter of fitting, with the exception of it has to be long enough and wide enough. After that, it's a matter of whether it looks right or not. I drew an extra seam line because I'm doing a 4-piece back, and then I'm cutting off some of the extra. The next step is to pin it back onto those ties about halfway in the back, doesn't matter exactly. And I also pinned a tie to the top of it as well, so that way I could bring it up over my shoulders easily. You're going to want to fidget with this to make sure you get it lined up and it's not twisted like mine is. I eventually get it in the right place. But I pinned those straps over the shoulders in place on my stays and double checked the back. When it comes to the front, usually 18th century gowns are done on a little bit of a bias where the grain line runs from that tie point on my stays down to the bottom of the center front. And that gives you a nice easy curve around some of the body parts that are a little bit more complicated with the fact that stays aren't perfectly conical. But because of the era that I'm working in and the stripes, I have to go vertical for this one. So my grain line is going to be running straight up and down, nearly straight up and down my front. It'll end up with a little bit of a curve. So I'm starting off by pinning this piece at the center front at the top and pinning all the way down. And then I'm also pinning into those tapes that are around my bust and my waist. This is going to be one of the important features of how we're going to match these backs to the fronts. I'm then continuing to smooth the fabric around my body while pinning to just those tapes. I will occasionally pin to the stays if I feel like I need a little bit more security, but those pins will eventually come out. The ones in the tapes will stay. So I'm pinning one at the top there because I'm not dealing with shoulder straps yet. That will be in the next part. And I'm just getting things pinned around my body as far as I can. The further you can go, the better, but you don't have to go really far. I'm only getting to this point on my side right now before you start to see all of those pleats and puckers down at the bottom, which is going to happen because I'm trying to get over my hip. So this is a good point to stop and make some marks. And I'm just marking where my waist is in the stays, where the point is, where they start to flare out. And then I'm going down and marking the center front. This likely will eventually change. It very often does, and it's a really easy point to adjust later. So I get that center front marked, and then I'm going to go along the neckline. I know that the gown needs to be higher up than my stays. How much higher is up to you, but I marked just above because I want a pretty open neckline. This is also giving me reference to know how far is too far as much as it is the choice of style. So I'm just marking out where my stays are at this point. Then I'm going to need to figure out the front point. How far down do I want that? What shape, whether it's rounded or squared, and connect the line that I made over my hip to that. I'll finesse this later. I then take a very small pair of scissors because I find that to be way easier to handle on myself, and clipping and trimming away some of that excess so that way I can get a smoother fit. I'm leaving probably about an inch of seam allowance there and clipping in around that portion just to make sure that I'm able to smooth things around my waist. So once I have done that, you can see it's much smoother. I can sort of tuck that under my arm and try to get one more pin in at the waist. Couldn't really get much else pinned other than a little bit more under the arm. I'm also going ahead and marking how far up under the arm I can go before I hit my armpit. It's pretty likely that when I get to the final version of this, it will get cut down further, but you want to know how far you can go before it starts to be an issue. You can keep trimming away extra later. I'm pretty far around to my sides. We're just going to need to figure out how to connect the fronts to the backs, which is where those tapes come in. So I'm going to unpin everything that's attached to my stays, but leave the fronts attached to those tapes and the backs as well. And now we suddenly have a pretty good idea of how these are going to match up. This may not be absolutely perfect because things do curve a little bit, and exactly how far up or down these two connect is a little widgy at this point, but this is a very close pattern. So you just need to go through and trace out the rest of the missing lines. Trace out where the front is overlapping the back. Again, this is a mock-up anyway, so it is not going to be perfect. Your fabric is going to stretch more or less. We're just trying to get a good idea. So I went ahead and put in pins to be able to try this back on again. I did find that the tapes kind of moved and shifted as I was doing this, so one reason to have slightly wider tapes, a little bit more resilient. But you can see we're pretty close. There's definitely more wrinkles than there should be. Part of that's just because I have a lot of extra fabric happening right now. Those wrinkles, though, are running up towards the front and down towards the back, and it would make sense to pull upwards on that front piece in order to smooth that out. So that's what I did. I just moved it up by 1 inch, and you can see it made a really big difference. It's not perfect. I did go ahead and attach a strap to the front piece right around where the shoulder strap would be as well. Just kind of pull that up, and that helped smooth things out just a little bit. I know there's way way more in my armpit than I'm going to want, but that's okay. Again, we can trim that off later. This gives me a pretty good idea. The reason why I need to know now whether I need to move the front way up or down in regards to where it attaches to the back is because I need to leave a lot of extra in the cutting to make sure that I can continue to shift it back and forth. But we're definitely getting there. We're getting closer every time. I trimmed things back a little bit and I moved things up. You can see every time I move it up, it gets a little bit smoother. This was probably about another ½ inch that I moved it up, but this gives me a pretty good idea of the shape that I need to go for. Now, this is obviously just one side. You feel free to do this on 2 sides if you want to make it a little bit more precise. This was enough for me to know that I should be fine. Before I take everything apart though, I do want to measure those shoulder straps that I've now pinned from the back to the front to make sure I know roughly what length they are. I'm going to cut a really big rectangle of the fabric, so it's not a big deal. I just need to know if it's roughly 10 inches or whatever it is. So unpinning all of these shoulder straps, laying everything back out, and just remarking and double checking everything that I've got so that way I have a pretty clear pattern piece to work off of. When it comes to the sleeves, there are 2 different shapes that you most commonly see in the 1780s. You have the 1-piece sleeve and the 2-piece sleeve, and to be honest, they're really going to be much the same thing. If you just fold the 1 piece in the right places, it's going to give you a really similar shape. This is the one that I'm using, is that 2-piece sleeve, so you need to make sure that it is wide enough across the biggest part of your bicep while you're flexing, and you need to make sure that it is wide enough across the elbow. It's not a matter of how wide is it at the lower portion of your arm or even just above the elbow, it's when you bend your elbow. The number of people I've seen end up with bruises in the crease of their elbow because they made it too tight down there to fit their forearm, so make sure to double check the measurement that way. I just take a general pattern and just make sure that it's wide enough for me, and then I add a bunch to the top, to be honest. So you can see I have a couple lines drawn there. The key points that we're going to make sure that we've got is enough length to get from the elbow crook up to the front of the gown, and then up to the back. So you want a big difference between those two because honestly, you can cut things off. You can take off more of the sleeve. If it is too short in that back area, you're not going to be able to move your arms forward. So it's a really big deal to make sure that there's a big difference. You can see I have about 3 or so inches between the 2 of mine. We can shift this sleeve way up onto the arm as long as we've left enough fabric at the top. So we're going to make sure there's enough of a difference that when we pin it in the front, there's enough space in the back. Then it's a matter of making sure that there is enough width. The width up at the top is determined by this curve. So you can curve very straight up. As you can see, the version that I have that's the pattern piece is a little bit narrower than the redrawn version of my final, which I sort of brought down about ½ an inch. I will widen that out in the future to make sure that I have enough space to get around my upper arm. That's a really important place. If you find that that's really tight all the time, you might want to flare out the top of your sleeve a little bit more in order to get a wider curve up at the top as well. Just give yourself extra space in both width and height of the sleeve head. If you're doing a 1-piece sleeve, it's much the same thing. Make sure that your width overall is enough to get over your arm, and then make sure that you've given enough of a big arch at the top for the sleeve head. Frankly, this pattern is a pretty old one and it would not fit me anymore. It's too shallow, it's not wide enough at the top, it's not going to make it up over my arm. So I would be adding a lot to this pattern at the top in order to use it in the future. Then it's on to actually cutting out of the fabric. I am starting off with just a single layer of the silk, and I am marking both the actual lines for the sewing as well as a pretty wide range of seam allowances. I want a 1/4 inch where I know it's good, but ½ inch under the arm, closer to 1 inch or 1.5 inches along that side back seam where I'm going to make all the adjustments, and extra at the top and the bottom of that in case I need to shift that seam around. Same thing goes with the back, 1/4 inch with the exception of that side back seam. And then once I have one layer of the stripe cut out, I can lay it down perfectly on top of the other stripe and get that precisely cut out, and then I can move on to cutting out the linen. I'm using a very stiff linen here that I have not pre-washed. This gown is not ever going to be put in the washing machine, so I don't have to worry about that, and it's a lot easier to work with a stiff linen than a soft one. Once I have everything cut out of the linen, I'm then moving on to marking out where the edges need to be folded back so it's really precise. Another good reason to use a stiff linen. It also folds really well along the edges, and I'm just going to go around both of the back pieces and the side back pieces and make sure to fold back all of the edges that I need to do to start, so that way I can assemble the back pieces and get ready for the first fitting. back pieces are taken care of, it's time to move on to the front. I won't be folding back nearly as many edges on this to start because a lot of things will be variable as I do the first fitting. So I do know that I like the neckline. That might end up changing, so I am just going to baste it together rather than stitch it together, but I'm going to not do anything with the center front because that's likely to end up changing. I'm not going to do anything under the arms or even down at the waist. All of that is going to be adjusted in the coming fittings, so I want to give myself the space to do that. So for right now, everything is just being basted together, so that way I have a nice solid front to work with. I am going ahead and basting back that cutaway front edge just so that way I'm sure I like the look of it before I end up stitching it. Then the first fitting happens. I've pinned the fronts to the back, and I've also cut out relatively large shoulder straps, pinned them in back, and adjusting them in front to get the correct length. I do notice, however, that they are pretty loose on the side. Around the neck, they're fine, but that means I'm going to have to adjust the angle in the back. It's too square right now. I also notice the fact that this is just overall a little bit too large. It end up taking about an inch out of each side down at the waist. So right now everything's wrinkling and sort of baggy in a way that I don't want, which is great though for a first fitting. I'm just going to make some simple adjustments of taking it in, and because you see the same diagonal lines as before, moving the back up slightly. I'm not going to worry about the fact that that ducktail is flipping up in back just yet. I'll work on making sure that it fits properly before I deal with where the waist needs to be. Next fitting, the shoulder straps have been adjusted on the outside of the back, so they're angled out a little bit more, which means that they're much snugger. I have taken the side back seams in and moved the fronts up slightly, so everything is fitting much more closely, a lot less in the way of wrinkles. I can still do some finessing, but it's much closer. The ducktail is still being a problem, which means that I will either need to cut up over the side hips a little bit more, which I figured I was going to have to anyway. I haven't moved the seam allowance out of the way, or I'm going to have to end up flaring the back slightly. I also notice the fact that there's a little bit of extra that I can pull up towards the front. I would keep putting it towards the back, but I'm worried about getting the flare back over the petticoat in the back. So I decided to recurve the front slightly and marked out where everything was pinned together, take the pins out, take the basting out, separate the layers, and get ready to start doing some basic assembly. The next step that I'm working towards for a fitting is to make sure that the bodice is assembled and fits correctly before I go anywhere near the sleeves. So the next steps are going to be adding the fronts to the back, folding over just the silk of the front and stitching through all the layers, and then folding in the lining and stitching that down. I'll end up doing a similar thing on the shoulder straps after I seam them to the front. I'll do the same sort of style on the back, and then I can try everything back on and make sure that it's good enough with slight adjustments to the center front. this fitting, I'm just double checking that once I've added the silk shoulder straps, it's still sitting correctly, that the bottom line of the bodice is actually getting up over my hips and it's not flaring up too much in the back anymore, that the back seams are correct. Like I said, you can continue to make some adjustments to that center front area as you need to, but everything else looks correctly done. So I'm able to move on to actually finishing all of the edges, going around the front edge, the neckline, the bottom edge, whatever I need to do to finish things off. I did originally figure I was going to finish off the bottom edge and then attach the skirt, but because the points in the back were just too finicky, I ended up with undoing all of the seam allowances that I had folded under, and as you'll see later, seaming it to the skirt to finish it off. But for right now, I'm just finishing off the neckline and the rest of those edges before moving on to the sleeves. For the sleeves, I'm not as worried about adding a bunch of seam allowance because I know by measurement these fit pretty well. I am, however, going to do a trick to seam them together. You lay down the 2 layers of the lining first, outer sleeve and inner sleeve, and then you lay the silk on top, inner sleeve and outer sleeve, with the right sides together. And this will allow to stitch 2 seams through all 4 of the layers, and the whole thing will flip right side out, and you won't have to stitch the lining and the external fabric separately. There is a trick doing this, however. Either you'll have to fold up the bottom of the fabric before you stitch the seams at the level that you want it, but if you aren't exactly sure if you might need to shorten these, you'll want to separate out the silks from the lining for just the last couple of inches. I do recommend that somewhere in this process that you try the sleeves on in the fabric that you're working with, just to make sure that they fit before you start trimming away extra seam allowance. Different fabrics, especially when you're adding in the bulk of a lining, will work in different ways, and you might find that it's just a little bit too snug when you're doing it in the actual final fabrics. So double check your fit before you start clipping everything away, and then it's just a matter of folding it right side out and magically you have a fully finished sleeve. You can do the same thing with a single piece sleeve. You just have to fold it in half first, lay it down on the lining in much the same way. Then it's time to start fitting the sleeves, which I know seems like the most complex part of this process, if anything, because how do you manage a sleeve where you can't reach nearly any of your arm unless you're moving into weird positions? The answer is we really only have to worry about the angle of the sleeve first. So we're not fitting the entire sleeve in. We're figuring out the rotation, where your arm sits comfortably, which is completely dependent on you, your body, and your posture. So that's all I'm trying to do right now, is figure out where that front seam in my sleeve matches up with the bodice. So I'm putting in a few pins just to make sure that it feels right, but I'm only going as far as I comfortably can from that front point and a little bit up over the shoulder. It seems pretty good, but I do notice that I could pull it up a lot further to get the under part of the sleeve up into my armpit properly, so I did repin a little bit after figuring that out. Make sure that you have your sleeve as far up as it needs to go for the underarm before you start pinning in the front, and because I left so much on top, I'm not worried about the overall fit just yet. I'm then taking it off and folding back the underarm of the sleeve and applying it to the bodice more nicely. The point here is that it's at the right rotation. I'm not worried about seam allowances in or out yet, just working with what I think it should be. So in my case, about ½ inch seam allowance was left, and I'm just trying to get it in the right rotation. I'm only pinning the underarm portion of the sleeve right now. I'm not getting to the upper portion. That is a different fitting problem that we will accomplish after this. It's then back on the body, and I can see it fits pretty well. It's a little tight across the top of the arm. However, when I don't have my arm pulled up in front of me like that, it pulls on the shoulder there, and that is not something that I want, which is telling me that it's not rotated correctly. I need to rotate that front seam down a little bit further because it's trying to pull the whole bodice that direction. So it's not a huge difference, but it seems to make everything a little bit tighter, a little bit harder to move. It wants to shift the bodice around, so I know that I need to try and fix the rotation before I go any further on anything else. I'm thinking it's going to have to move down about 1 inch to start, and then we'll see if it's better. It's not way off, it's just enough. So I twisted it by 1 inch, and look at that. Now I can put my arm down, even move it back a little bit, and it's not pulling nearly so much on the bodice. The fit overall is actually a little bit better. It's not pulling up on the bodice when I raise my arm. It's not nearly so tight across the top of the arm. Essentially, we're just rotating this to get the fullness in the right position. And it made such a big difference. So this entire process of the actual fitting of the upper portion of the sleeve now is going to go much easier now that we have the rotation in the right place. This is where I'm just trying to get as far as I can. I'm pinning it just flat onto the shoulder strap. I'll make adjustments and marks later to get it in the correct position with the shoulder strap over the sleeve. But for right now, I'm just pinning as many pins as I comfortably can into my shoulder strap and leaving the fullness towards the back area of the upper sleeve. That's where we're going to make adjustments later. I'm also double checking that I could still make full movements in this and not have to worry about anything yanking too hard. I'm going to potentially be dancing, so it's kind of important. Then taking the bodice off, it's time to move the pins over into a position on the interior where I can actually do the sewing. Thankfully, with that linen, it has a nice little crease exactly where I want the seam to be, so I'm just making sure to hold the sleeve in place relative to the bodice while I do this process. For the upper portion, I marked both the sleeve and the shoulder strap and then pulled them apart, folded back just the silk of the shoulder strap and laid it over the sleeve. We're going to be doing this the same way as the other seams where the lining will encapsulate this later. For right now though, I'm just trying to get the front portion of this sleeve fit on top. It's definitely not a bad idea to try this on and off. You don't necessarily need to do it with your entirety of your stays, but just making sure the sleeve feels right. Like I said, there is going to be some fullness towards the back with most 18th century patterns, and you're going to want to make a couple of tiny little tucks. Some originals have 2, some have 3, some have 2 on one side and 3 on the other. They're just small enough that they don't make the sleeve puffy, and you just want them far enough towards the back that, again, they aren't making the top of your arm puffy. So it's just kind of in a subtle place where you need a little bit of extra space to be able to move your arm around. Feel free to match them up really cleanly if you want to, or just not, because most historical examples are not really matched up at all. Then the important thing with the sleeve is it needs to be done in a very sturdy way, so we're going to use a back stitch in a heavier silk thread underneath the arm. I'm using this mid-weight silk for all of my sturdy things on this gown and a really fine one for some of the edges. But the shoulder strap gets done in much the same way as the other seams, which is a spaced back stitch, and then the lining will be folded over and whipped down. The back stitch portion is just on the shoulder strap. It stops where the shoulder strap stops, both in front and in back. The skirt is, in many ways, the simpler part. I'm just using 2 wide panels of the fabric and seaming them together up the back. I like to go a combination of running stitch and back stitch because there's not going to be a lot of stress on this. It doesn't really matter. I'm leaving the top of that seam open because of the deep V and the way that the skirts fold back. You don't have to do this. This is just my preference because I'm working with a lightweight fabric and I know that I'm going to fold the pleats so that way it gives a little bit more fullness. Pleating can definitely seem like one of the more complicated parts. I have an equation that I use for this if I need to, but I also like to just go in and match up stripes in a way that looks good and then try to find out if it works. But this is the equation that I tend to use for figuring out my pleats. Copy that down if you need it, but you can also eyeball it. Once you get them pinned into place, I like to do 2 rows of pins so they're nice and stable. I can then go in and baste it. I'm going to layer that basting downwards towards the back because of the V. This will be a trained skirt, so I don't need to keep it perfectly level around the waist, but it does kind of help give me space to shift things back and forth. I do prefer to do the pinning of a skirt on a mannequin if possible, just because it really allows me to see the overall fullness and the right angles, but it can be done flat on a table. It's not really a terribly big deal. You just might need to spend some more time shifting it up and down in order to get it in the right spot. Because I have the train on this, I'm only really worried about getting it up high enough in the front and then trying to give myself as much length as possible in the back. So I'm going to work it over the hips and then actually rotate the pleats out to be nearly horizontal as I'm going down that V. I do have 2 little box pleats at the very center back that match up with the stripes on the bodice, so that way it kind of looks like a bit of a continuation and it adds a little bit more fullness to that center back, which is a good place to do that. It doesn't hurt to put in a double pleat there or little box pleats or something to add a little bit more fullness to deal with whatever shapes you're asking it to do. But this ends up being a pretty long train in back without having to necessarily cut a long train. As I said, I chose to flip the seam allowance back out of the bodice and I'm seaming it to the skirt. I struggled with trying to get the points of the back to be clean and even, and I just wasn't liking the way that it was looking in its final format, so this was a much simpler way for me to deal with it. Both methods are historically accurate. You can completely finish off your bodice and then essentially top stitch it onto the skirt. This way also works. I do find this is a really strong stitch. and this works really well if you have a very narrow point. Front edges and the hem of the skirt are then just folded back and stitched with a little whip stitch, and from there it's just a matter of trimming. I'm not doing a ton of trimming on this gown. I'm just doing a little bit of a lace tucker around the sleeves and the neckline to finish it off. I found an antique gold lace that I'm using. I'm just gathering that up to a tape, and then the tape will be attached to the gown so that way I can easily remove it for laundering either the gown or the ruffles, or for that matter, moving it onto a different gown in the future.